limit, man. Okay, calm down.
You broke a major story. And before you get into the story, which is about Ron DeSantis, I was wondering, because I listened to your podcast about it, how did you even stumble onto this in the first place? Like, what made you think of looking into his military past?
You know, he had an ad for his gubernatorial reelection campaign where he is an Air Force pilot. So it's called Top Gov. You know, I saw that and it was funny to me because I knew that he wasn't in the Air Force and was not a pilot, but that he did have some military background. And so I decided to look into that and to see what it was. And the thing that piqued my interest in the story was, you know, he I think is still in the military, but he has a military past. He had been in the military since 2004. And the thing that stuck out to me was we know that he did a tour in Guantanamo Bay. And when he ran for governor in 2018, there was a lot of Florida media in particular that was trying to find out what he did at Guantanamo Bay. It was as part of, he had only alluded to it. He said, I was served at Gitmo, but that's all he ever said. Nobody knows what he did there. So when I found all these stories from Florida press for his 2018 campaign, all they did was basically take at face value what the Navy and what other officers had said. And so all that you would find in the media was that Ron DeSantis, as a JAG lawyer, which is the military's legal system, was there to ensure, quote, the human rights of detainees are respected and that the U.S. was operating within the boundaries of international law. And there's also interviews with fellow officers who worked with him at Guantanamo and superiors who said that was his job, was to ensure the human rights of detainees and ensure that international law was being followed. And that's all there was. It wasn't questioned. It was just printed as, this is what Ron DeSantis did at Guantanamo Bay. Anyone who knows anything about Guantanamo Bay knows that 2006, the year that Ron DeSantis was there as the human rights lawyer, was the height of the Bush torture program. And the entire world was looking at Guantanamo Bay. The United Nations was calling for it to be shut down. In 2006, that same year, the United Nations Human Rights Board met and said it was in complete violation of international law for indefinite detention, torture, and all of this. And so that's what made me want to look into it, is knowing that he was there, but the only answer to what he was doing was something that just could not be true.
Let's take a look at this video. Trigger warning. It's an awful video that obviously, because it's Ron DeSantis. And then we'll get into your investigation.
Sure.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your governor speaking.
Today's training evolution, dogfighting, taking on the corporate media.
The rules of engagement are as follows. Number 1, don't fire unless fired upon, but when they fire, you fire back with overwhelming force.
Does it say that in the bill? I'm asking you to tell me what's in the bill.
Number 2, never ever back down from a fight.
If I could complete the question, though.
So you're going to give a speech or ask a question?
Number 3, don't accept their narrative.
It's wrong. It's a fake narrative. I just disabused you of the narrative, and you don't care about the facts. It's why people don't trust people like you, because you peddle false narratives.
All right, ladies and gentlemen.
What's gonna
Oof. So tell us what you found, since that is fiction. What was the truth?
Yeah, well, you know, the first couple years of DeSantis's career in the Navy are pretty boring. You know, he did stuff like in charge of urinalysis, meaning the drug peeing in a cup and drug testing of other sailors. So there's nothing really interesting about his first 2 years. But what's interesting is that in 2006, he gets this big break. He goes from doing, physical training scheduling to being sent to Guantanamo Bay in March 2006 at a very particular time and for a very particular purpose. Ron DeSantis went, and it's true that was what his former superiors and military records said, was that officially his job was to ensure the human rights of detainees. That's, of course, what it was on paper. The interesting thing is that was not a job that had already existed, that he was just rotating into as a young officer. That's something that he went to go do, and no one at Guantanamo had seen a human rights lawyer come in and say, I'm here to ensure that your human rights are being protected. What was happening at the time was throughout 2005 and early in 2006, conditions at Guantanamo were so horrific. And of course, to remind people, most of the people at Guantanamo had never committed a crime. I mean, they were just people sold to the CIA, kidnapped by warlords in Afghanistan and Taliban, said, oh, these guys are Al-Qaeda, even though they were just political opponents or just random teenagers that they found, kidnapped them, sold them to the CIA, and then they got sent to Guantanamo. So the majority had never committed a crime, and they are subjected to just horrific torture and treatment every second of every day. And of course, all believed that they were never going to leave. And that was the intent of the United States. They were never going to let any of those people leave. So hundreds of prisoners were taking part in a hunger strike throughout 2005. The US government viewed this hunger strike as a massive threat because they were already in a kind of international and national scandal regarding torture at Guantanamo Bay. In fact, remember the 2007-2008 election, Obama rose to the top as the only one who was saying they're going to close Guantanamo Bay, and then won on that program as well. And so torture and the conditions at Guantanamo and its violation of international law was a big story that a lot of people cared about. The hunger strike was making it much harder for the administrators of Guantanamo. It kept it in the international spotlight. It allowed their plight to become a national and international crisis. And so a group of officers were brought in to Guantanamo to break the hunger strike. A new general and people whose job specifically was, we're going to smash this hunger strike and we're going to break any and all resistance by the detainees that they're taking part in. It seems that Ron DeSantis was part of that crop of people brought into Guantanamo to break the hunger strikers. And so while officially his job was to hear the demands of the detainees and tell them, I'm here to ensure your human rights are being respected. Well, that was officially what his job. What a man I interviewed named Mansour Adayfi, who was there from 2002 to 2016, he said when DeSantis got there, everyone was like, oh, our protest is working. Like, now we have this attorney whose job it is human rights, and we can negotiate with him and we can tell him what the issues are, and we can maybe get some kind of resolution. Things like sleep deprivation and desecration of the Quran, things that are war crimes that they wanted to stop. He said that in actuality what happened, Ron DeSantis was basically playing good cop, talked to detainees about what was hurting them the most and impacting them the most. And then the prison administration multiplied, magnified, increased each one of those things that they had complained about. So the intent was to maximize the impact of the torture. And that was the role that Ron DeSantis was playing. He also not only was he playing this kind of good cop role where he'd meet with people and be like, yeah, I'm on your side, and then go tell the prison administrators, hey, do more sleep deprivation because that's really hurting them. He was also present for beatings, for torture, and in particular, force feedings. The tactic to break the hunger strikers ultimately came down to force feeding, which is a really gruesome tactic. I mean, someone is tied to a chair, their head's tied down in every possible point. They use a rubber tube up their nose, but they brought in like really thick tubes to put through their nasal cavity, have like a metal point at the end, so it's extremely painful. And then they basically like fill them completely full with Ensure like diet drinks. They say that there's laxatives in there so that people, while they're being force fed, they're defecating on themselves, they're vomiting. And the person I interviewed, Mansour, said while he was being force fed, while he was defecating himself, vomiting, screaming and pleading for help, he looks to Ron DeSantis and the human rights lawyer and says, you have to help me. Like, look what they're doing. And his response from DeSantis was smiling, was laughter, and telling Mansour, maybe you should eat then. Maybe you shouldn't be hunger striking if you don't like this. So, I mean, that's the essence of the story. And I think there's some implications for what he did in Iraq. And there's a lot more about his time at Guantanamo, I think, that needs to be investigated. But previous to that, nothing had been known. All that had been known about his time at Guantanamo was he was the lawyer ensuring the rights of detainees, when in fact he was doing very much the opposite.
And how did you go about investigating this?
I found someone who was there at the time who's now released. Mansour was released
Who's an
in
amazing
2016
person.
because he hadn't done anything, and he's an outspoken person on the issue of closing Guantanamo. And so, yeah, I mean, I knew that I had to hear it from someone firsthand, and he definitely had a firsthand experience.
Yeah. And then you spoke to someone else, right? Who was in Iraq. Can you talk about that?
So yes, one other thing that I think is important about
Yeah.
Guantanamo is that there is other incident that happened that Ron DeSantis was present for that
Oh
I think
yeah.
needs to be investigated more, and that was the very likely murder of 3 protest leaders at the camp. So in June 2006, which DeSantis was there from March 2006 until January 2007, so he was definitely there. There was a prison uprising. There was like a riot. They were getting ready to start the hunger strike again. I mean, the force feeding that DeSantis was part of broke the hunger strike in about 5 days, because if you're being force fed like that 5 times a day, anyone will give up. I mean, no one can withstand unlimited torture. So in June 2006, things were starting up again. The hunger strike was starting again. There was huge uprisings in the prison, and 3 of the protest leaders were found each in their respective cell with their hands and feet bound together, severely beaten, hanging by their necks, and with large pieces of cloth stuffed down their throats. The Navy did an autopsy and said they all committed suicide in some kind of suicide pact to get back at to hurt the United States and do jihad against the United States. No one could do another autopsy because they sent the bodies home with no organs and parts of their throat removed. But it wasn't until 2015 that a book by Staff Sergeant Joseph Hickman, who was a guard at Guantanamo Bay, who was part of putting down that prison uprising, says that those people were definitely tortured to death and to set an example. And that further Freedom of Information Act documents in 2017 kind of corroborated the fact that the suicides is highly unlikely. So that's another highly suspicious incident,
right? And
that
how
we
could
know
I mean?
DeSantis was there for.
But also how could they possibly pretend that was suicide? How could they physically have done that? Their hands were tied.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. This is the Bush administration era. I mean, they were operating in such a nefarious way at Guantanamo, especially. I mean, that's why Guantanamo existed, was to do all these extra legal things, to exist in the shadows, to exist
Right.
outside the bounds of the law. So it's, and those were just the first deaths in many more to come. And there hadn't been any deaths up until that point, but then more, quote unquote, suicides started happening.